Hi there, I'm Chris Crescent. This is Talking Tsundoku Blues. Another one for the spooky season. Today, it's Thomas Ligotti, The Nightmare Factory. If you're familiar with Thomas Ligotti, you'll know that he's a short story writer, although he does have a novella and some essays. But this, The Nightmare Factory, is a collection of 4 of his short stories adapted into comic form. I hesitate to say graphic novel because it's really 4 stories that are not connected, and all of them have appeared before in various collections of his. And he actually did not write the script for these. He simply writes a little introduction to the story, and then they are adapted by some comic writers, Stuart Moore and Joe Harris. Thomas Ligotti was a name that I had heard sort of whispered amongst people that I knew, people who were in the know. In the 90s and the early 2000s, his name was kind of spoken as a shorthand for a cool cult writer. Oh, you know H.P. Lovecraft and you know Bruno Schultz, but have you ever read Thomas Ligotti? It's such a cool name, Thomas Ligotti. You know, it has this kind of a nightmarish quality, just his name itself. And that name was sort of on the edge of my consciousness for a long time, without me ever having read his stuff. But I imagined he must be such an amazing nightmare world that he's building, that people that I know are just, kind of whispering about his work. And when I finally got a chance to read his stories, I'll admit that I was a little underwhelmed. I was lucky enough to read a few of his short stories, and later some of those would be collected in Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grimscribe from Penguin. Those collections are from the mid-'80s and early '90s, and they were out of print for years, and then Penguin re-released them in 1 volume, which I actually don't have that, but it's worth checking out. Ligotti is very hit or miss for me. Some of his stories are really freaky and really moody, and I like to stay in that mood, but some of them I feel like I wish he would be a little more scary and a little more over the edge. Personally, I don't find puppets to be that terrifying, so it might be just your preference of what kind of horror or what kind of existential dread you are looking for. When I went to Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon in 2000-something, I found this collection, The Nightmare Factory, and I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. It's published by Fox Atomic, which actually doesn't exist anymore. And there is a 2nd volume of this, which I seem to have lost in the intervening years. But this collection has 4 of his short stories. And I like this collection because it really shows his world and his ideas without all of the kind of over-the-top purple prose. Some people have called his writing, very dense, and it can be. But also, I think the ideas and the imagery, ironically, shine through in this collection, even though the art is nothing too special. But especially the very first story in here, which is The Last Feast of Harlequin. It's a really, really well-made story. It is dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft. Ligotti himself admits that it's a bit of a pastiche of Lovecraftian elements, a protagonist who is a man of science, an architecturally bizarre town that is off the beaten track, a cult that practices cryptic rituals, and finally, monsters. All of these elements are found in Lovecraft's horror tales. But the focus is more on the narrator's psychology. This is from the actual prose story, the original short story, The Last Feast of the Harlequin. The singing abruptly stopped, and the towering white-haired figure began to speak. He was welcoming those of the new generation. 20 winters had passed since the pure ones had expanded their ranks. The word pure in this setting was a violence to what sense and composure I still retained, for nothing could have been more foul than what was to come. Thos, and I employ this defunct identity only as a convenience, closed his sermon and drew closer to the dark-skinned altar. Then, with all the flourish of his former life, he drew back the topmost covering. Beneath it was a limp-limbed effigy, a collapsed puppet sprawled upon the slab. I was standing toward the rear of the congregation and attempted to keep as close to the exit passage as I could. Thus, I did not see everything as clearly as I might have. That's from the climax of the original story. The nice thing about the Nightmare Factory is that each of the stories moves right along, and they do seem to keep pretty much all of the elements of the originals. It's just condensed, and there's a lot of visual emphasis as opposed to Ligotti's sometimes over-the-top prose. In this story, the main character is an anthropologist, and he travels to the small village of Miracaw, and right away he notices that something is strange because the town itself, the architecture is not quite right. He says, "At first, Miracaw put me in the mind of an album of old snapshots, particularly ones in which the camera had been upset in the process of photography, causing the pictures to develop at an odd angle. But despite the disharmonies, I was primarily concerned with locating the city hall." So there's that Lovecraftian strange architecture going on. And then he stops to ask for directions from this very zombified-looking individual, and his face seemed dimly familiar. He finds out from the staff at the community center that there is a festival, and it seems to involve clowns and fools, and it's revealed that he studied under a man named Dr. Raymond Thos, an old professor who sent him a 20-year-old article about this festival. This archaeologist seems to have a clown costume. I guess he's a clown in his off time or as a hobby. So he brings his clown costume along, and he proceeds to join in the festival. But what he doesn't realize is that there's a lot more going on than just festivities. It seems that people like to abuse the clowns and call them freaks, and this is something that is widely accepted amongst the populace. There are also more zombified-looking individuals, and he finds himself participating in some of the violence. He even surprises himself with how wicked he can be. As the festival progresses, he begins to lose his grip on reality, and he gets overcome by wanting to be a part of these kind of frightening zombified individuals, and it leads him into an absolute nightmare scenario. There's a little bit of Kafka, there's a lot of Lovecraft, there's even kind of an X-Files-iness to it. The next story is called Dream of a Mannikin, very typical for Ligotti, using mannequins, dolls, and puppets. He really seems to like to go back to those effigies or models of human existence. In this one, there's this psychologist, and a girl named Amy Locker comes to see him, and she is obsessed with these mannequins that she works with in the window, the store window, and she has to dress and undress these mannequins. And it ends up infiltrating her dreams, and her dreams end up influencing the psychologist himself. And as it goes along, we start to realize that this girl, Amy Locker, may be an unwitting pawn of an ex-girlfriend of this psychologist. There's a lot of details of hypnotism and dreams within dreams, not being able to awaken from the nightmare. And the entire comic is set up as a letter to his ex-girlfriend or ex-wife, perhaps, accusing her of sending this poor girl to him and manipulating her and causing madness for everyone involved. The third story is Dr. Locrian's Asylum. I love all the names of Ligotti characters, Locrian and Thos. In his introduction, he says, "There is a long-time connection between madness and supernatural horror. A fractured mind is often the way into a world not suspected by those of an innocent normality. Reciprocally, the supernatural may invade our world through a doorway provided by a mangled brain. A fine recent example of this two-way street has been shown to us in the film Session 9, wherein a crew of men cleaning up an abandoned mental institution find themselves crossing the line where reason and reality are both out of balance. In this instance, none of the men make it back to business as usual. An earlier example of the special relationship between the insane and the supernatural is featured in Bram Stoker's Dracula. How natural it seems that an inmate of Dr. Seward's asylum named Renfield should be in league with the bloodsucker that has come to visit the coastal town of Whitby, England." So he kind of gives away the plot of this story. Essentially, there is an old asylum, an institution that is about to be torn down. And Mr. Crane, the main character, is investigating it right before it's demolished. And he ends up seeing some visions just before the explosion, and he tries to stop the demolition. Then he ends up in a bookstore, which is run by Mr. Locrian, and he says, "Did you know that my grandfather, Dr. Harkness Locrian, was buried in that graveyard? Tell me, did you ever hear those stories about the sanitarium? What some people saw in its windows? Perhaps you yourself were one of them." I don't know what I've seen." And then he begins to tell the story of his grandfather and how he would spend most of his life at the institution because he was the warden. You say warden or the director? Anyway, he was the boss of the asylum, the institution. And even in his elder years, when he was forced to retire, he would sit at his bedroom window and he would gaze across the town and look at the asylum, the sanitarium, all day. And after the institution is destroyed, then, of course, there starts to be these horrific visions that are seen around town. The town itself becomes sort of infected by whatever was being kept there. One of my favorite stories in the collection, maybe my favorite story in this collection. Either The Last Feast of Harlequin or Dr. Locrian's Asylum. Both of those stories are very excellent, and I think they really benefit from the comic treatment. So the last story in this little collection is called Teatro Grottesco, which is the name of another Thomas Ligotti short story collection. And this story is probably my least favorite in this collection, and overall I don't really like it that much. The idea is nice, but the execution falls flat for me. Basically, there's a fringe theater, this group of kind of cult artists or mystics, I guess, mystical artists that go from town to town, and it sort of appears in secret, and only those in the know can participate, and those who participate sometimes disappear. It made me think of the film Eyes Wide Shut a little bit, or actually, I feel like it's kind of a ripoff of Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. The same kind of idea. No one knows who or what is behind the Teatro Grottesco. That is, our world theater. But whoever or whatever it is seems to get off on staging the cruel mise-en-scene of what we like to call life, which is a complete construct of our heads, and not anything guided by a coherent plot. The Teatro Grottesco does not go in for coherence. Its genre is disorder, a chaotic succession of derangements and deformations. And he also says, one can only wonder what idiot would choose to join the company of the doomed. So again, the idea behind this is actually really cool and very existential, very nihilistic, but the execution, I mean, I feel like the main character is kind of based on Ligotti himself. Even I, as a writer of nihilistic prose works, savored the inconsistency and flamboyant absurdity of what was told to me. This guy's got some machinery in his eye there. From the moment I perceived the teatro to be an anti-artistic phenomenon, I conceived the ambition to make my form of art, my nihilistic prose writings, into an anti-teatro phenomenon. but almost immediately he gets sick and sort of incapacitated, and he cannot go through with what he had planned. He gets some strange visitors at his door. And of course, I'm not going to spoil any of these stories for you. If you don't know anything about Thomas Ligotti, I think that this collection is a nice place to start, actually. I find his prose writing to be somewhat difficult at times, and unnecessarily so. He can be quite verbose. He can use way too many descriptors. He wants to be Bruno Schultz. He wants to be H.P. Lovecraft, but Lovecraft himself has a tendency toward purple prose. Edgar Allan Poe as well, but Ligotti is infected even more with the purple prose tendency. So that's not to say you shouldn't read him. I think his work is valuable, and there are a lot of really interesting ideas. It's a different kind of horror than most people are used to reading. It's certainly not Stephen King. It's not even Laird Barron or Brian Evenson, although I would say it shares some qualities with Evenson. Ligotti also has essays that you can find. This is an interesting little journal called Collapse, where he wrote an essay in here alongside China Mieville and Michael Houellebecq. His essay is called Thinking Horror. And James Trafford actually also writes about Ligotti. So this is an interesting little journal. Ligotti also has a very famous essay called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which I would also recommend because it really shows his kind of nihilistic worldview. The man is the ultimate curmudgeon. He's the ultimate misanthrope. He really takes a very negative view of humanity, of existence, but that can be quite refreshing at times. Sometimes we need to be shaken up a little bit and look at the existential dread that pervades our minds at 3 a.m. when we can't sleep, and all we are thinking about is, what is this all about? What is this existence? So, thanks for listening to my rambles about The Nightmare Factory. Check it out. There's a second volume of this also. These are out of print, but I think they're fairly easy to find, pretty cheap. It's a nice little nightmare to dip into during the spooky season. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching. See you again.